You want to know something that I think is so interesting, but I think it's like, I feel like a lot of a lot of content creators in social justice work and social commentary. One thing that I would highly encourage is when people are taking a look, a attempt at least to take a holistic view across present day and sort of like do this analytical work of looking at the past as well as the present and potentially even guesstimating the future, is do not fail to recognize context. Okay. Right now, right, our social norms are changing in a way that quite literally I would probably act into probably like milliseconds. What was cool within 3 months ago is no longer cool, right? You have these errors over historic periods of time where it's like the 90s, the 70s, right? You've got the hippies, you've got, the yuppies and all the things, and the kids are moving to the city, and information is traveling a lot less fast, right? So it's traveling incredibly slower. So we were able to kind of look at these times and make historical observations. And I think that, historians and those who, researchers and things like that were able to really conclude certain things during these times. However, fast forward present day, all right, 20th century, and you have the introduction to technology, and it's moving faster than our brains can even faster than we can even comprehend. And so a lot of people in the work of social commentary, I've said this before, just because you can put a statistics up there doesn't mean that you're inferring or introducing that statistic in a way that is correct, right? That you may not be presenting it correctly. And a lot of times, when people enter into these spaces, which I would say somewhat is like journalistic, people aren't really taking into consideration their own bias. So as you know, if you've studied journalism, I've studied journalism. I didn't graduate, but I did study journalism. And, they tell you that you can't be biased, right? And so with this, you have to realize that a lot of people in these spaces are biased, right? A lot of people will do, videos that really support their argument, which is fine, but it's also biased and it's also blindsided. And so it's dangerous, I think, especially when we start taking historic figures and you're trying to drag them, which brings me to my point about the commentary I shared about Toni Morrison. I was actually on Instagram and someone was talking about her book called Jazz. And I was thinking about just the reality of Toni Morrison's entire body of work. And I found it interesting. I mean, it's a relatively small platform, but just how no one really knew any Toni Morrison books. And I was on live and I was just asking them like, hey, what are some good book recs, right? Because Toni Morrison, as it stands, yes, she was the first. And I was just, asking some questions, not necessarily attacking her per se, but I was just more so questioning, okay, what did Toni Morrison necessarily do for the culture? Maybe I don't understand it. Maybe I didn't understand it from a fictional standpoint. I think a lot of people reference her work and we kind of like project our references and the things we want things to mean. But what exactly does it mean? What does it stand for? And I just was more so questioning that period of time in which, you have these Black writers and there's only a few, but across decades, right, there's been thousands of Black writers who have changed the culture and who have done very courageous things with their literature. And so that's all I was wondering, especially with Toni Morrison being a predominantly fiction writer. I don't really read fiction books. I'm not really in that space, right? So those were just some of my questions, but I held my curiosity very loosely, right? I don't read Toni Morrison, right? I'm also at a place where my question was more so just questioning overall how African-American people can sometimes be the first. And sometimes with that introduction to society by and large, right, it's marketable. It's the first time people are seeing it. It becomes something that is heavily celebrated, even if there were others during that span, right, that were equally great or if not better, right? And their work was transformative in that way. So that's all I was saying. This wasn't a critique on her. How could I? Right. But I'm more so saying all that to say it's like we have to hold criticism very lightly when we do this type of content. And I think that's something that kind of concerns me. Is like you have these people with these large platforms and people just kind of double down on this person and their bias. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It feels comforting to find people who share your same mindset, who find people who agree with you. Like all that's fine. But I just think when you start taking the work of African American people, you have to be kind of mindful of that. And, there is this thing, but I won't say it's a thing. I don't think it's a grift per se, but I do think that it is its own kind of like type of content where people are really hell bent on exposing people. And I say that about Cheyenne Brand. I think that, and I don't even know if I'm saying her name right, but I think that that's another really great example. And I think for the longest of time, right, looking at it in a contextual standpoint, from a contextual point of view, African American people have always kind of been kept outside of systems. And those who do enter into the systems, which you guys also critique, are not as radical. I do believe in their proximity. I believe in their comfort. I believe in their connections and their relationships. They have grown to essentially experience upward mobility in a way that sort of desensitizes them to the struggles of Blackness, right? Which is the reason why they went to school and they went into the institutions, to get away from some of that marginalization, right? To get away from some of the hardships, right? The harsh realities of being an African American person. And so they don't necessarily have the same standpoint. They don't necessarily have the same point of view. They may not even really be heavily involved in social advocacy in that way. And so with that being said, they're not necessarily always as influential, especially when you start talking about reaching the masses, educating African American people, resonating with others who do not have the same educational experience, which we know, right, historically speaking. And even fast forward today, there is an illiteracy crisis. There has always been a literacy crisis, right? We were denied the right to read as African American people. And so even with African spirituality, even with certain practices that are demonized within Western society, it doesn't take away from the fact that these things were helpful. It doesn't take away from the fact that, I gave the example of doulas, right? But it doesn't take away from the fact that some women do really have ancestral wisdom, and some people really do know that, sea moss can do this for your body, and that taking these particular things could, lower your risk of cardiovascular disease, right? And we also know that when we start talking about being inundated within our institutions, within American society, it is very generalized, right? We know that historically and even present day, African American people and other communities of color, right, minorities, are excluded from Western psychology, from Western medicine, right? And from any type of Western practice that is a practice that is upheld within our institutions, right? Does it feel good to have access to these things, to have access to the knowledge of a better life, to eating healthy, whatever the case may be? Absolutely, right? But at the same time, we also know that this does not necessarily take into the consideration of cultural differences. How, for example, Hispanics prefer a certain type of Spanish rice, right? That doesn't take into consideration what Western society would say about starches, right? African American people prefer a particular level of comfort food, right? I'm not talking about in access, right? We could talk about, portions and health and all those different things. Yeah, but there's also something very comforting in our food. And it's also very cultural. And so it's just like, you have to just kind of be mindful of the things that we say and the things that we feel the need to kind of jump on and unravel. And I think even with Bryant, right, for example, I don't really know her background. From what I did see when she was kind of making her way through the social media streets and being and being on more platforms, I think her intention was to sort of like help save Black men and help them recognize certain things within their relationships. And I don't think that she was the first person. There's an entire creator economy about, and not just Black people, but in general, where people talk about relationships. Some people may refer to themselves as a relational expert. They may base that on getting married at 18 and being married for 30 years. They may base it on dating in Miami. They may base it on traveling the world and dating different guys and girls and all these different things, right? So it's just like, I don't really know, right? We're living in a day and age where there's self-proclamation. And with that being said, I don't necessarily know if for many people the intention is to harm people and to deliberately be dishonest, or if the intention is to simply make money in a capitalistic society that you guys love to throw around. You love a buzzword, okay, where people got to make it. You know what I mean? And so how can we really critique a thing when we don't really understand the context of the thing in which we're living in? Because that context is the very thing in which we're living in today, right? And I said this in a previous video where I said, yo, I think that we are way too ahead of the curve. Like, we're wanting to document culture in the sense as it stands, right? We're wanting to call things out and talk about things and, really kind of categorize things as black and white as it's still unfolding. Right. Bryant is still unfolding. Now, if she had gone into practice into, meeting with black men and we found out that she was maybe sleeping with all of them or whatever, right? Like there was some type of deliberate heinous acts that was being committed with her labeling herself as, I don't know if she was a relational doctor. I don't know what she was calling herself. Right. Like, then maybe we could say, okay, this is a problem. And I think we kind of see this, for example, with Dr. Umar. It was like, okay, we're starting to get skeptical. You're talking about a school. The school has never been built. But then there was also some practical realities of like Dr. Umar being exiled from institutions, from modern society by and large, because he does carry a historic mindset that is, very radical, in which, many black men and black people who held that type of ideology were exiled. And they also didn't want to partake in society, right? So here you have it fast forward, and essentially Dr. Umar is acting and behaving in a way that people might refer to as historic, right? African-American people, for the most part, have come a long way from that sense of like radicalism, right? Although people do still look to Dr. Umar to have conversations and to speak out about certain things because we appreciate that. It's almost like homage to the black people, right? But is Dr. Umar a professor? You know what I mean? So it's just like, I don't know. I think that it's not just about nuance. It's not just about, well, maybe it's about nuance, of course, but I also think it's about just acknowledging the complexities and the time in which we're living in. And I think sitting with that complexity can help people sit a little bit longer with their content instead of choosing to say something is black and white. But just like how you're calling certain people dishonest or whatever the case may be, and you're looking for an expose, you too could be part of that, right? Because instead of you kind of sitting with your thoughts, sitting with the reality that the context has changed, that things are different, you're going to keep putting out content, even if you're living in a day and time where you can't really document it per se, right? Per se, to say who's an expose and who's not, because it's like we're still living in it, right? You don't have enough evidence to conclude on certain people and certain things when things are just kind of getting started. You know what I mean? Like, we can look back and maybe a few years from now and say, yo, this is what happened with Derrick Jackson. You know what I mean? That was a crazy time. That was a crazy thing. You know what I mean? It's said and done. It's cleared and it's out the way. But like, if there hasn't really been any harm done, for example, with like Dr. Umar, we don't know, right? If he did really build a school or whatever the case may be, I'm using him as an example. Then we can look back and say, this person was just like really running amok on black people, right? And so it's just like, I don't know. I think sometimes we're seeking answers that just haven't yet to be answered, and we don't have enough information. And I think there's a level of intellectual humility that is required, but just like you and the people that you may be talking about or referencing, you all are all trying to get money, right? So you have to continue to make the content, even if you don't necessarily have the information. And so, we're all sort of like hypocrites in that way, because I think as much as we talk a lot about people getting money, people doing things, people, harming the black community with, financial gain, we too are partaking in that when we abuse our platforms, especially when we're talking about being intellectuals, when we're talking about being academics, when we're talking about being the champions of literacy. You know what I mean? So if it's all about a dollar, just know that everybody's intentions is going to be questioned at the end of the day, and I think that's pretty much what I wanted to get on here and say. And I think I made myself very clear, and I'm happy I was able to kind of get around to this. I know this was a bit murky. I know I might have said some things that might have been like, what, but I just hope that we can be clear on that, because I do think black people, there's a small portion of us who are starting to kind of turn on one another, who's starting to see one another through a lens of being disingenuous, which, I'm not taking away from that. We're people, we're individuals at the end of the day, although we have a shared history and we do have a culture that is very rich in this country. At the same time, we're still people, right? And in doing so, people are going to be disappointed regardless of the color of your skin. But I think by and large to, just kind of really double down, and be quick to kind of talk about certain things and try to put certain people out there. I just don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't think we have enough information, You know what I mean? People's platforms have been up for what, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. We don't have enough of a track record to say this person did this. We don't have enough information to say whether or not this person actually committed harm. You know what I mean? Like I said, when money is involved and you put an African American person at the center, things are going to get murky. I'm not saying everybody is dishonest. I'm not saying everybody is doing things to, exploit people who look like them for profit. No, but I am saying, depending on the context, right? Given where we are current day, survival of the fittest, okay? Trump's economy, people are doing what they got to do. And that includes you. You know what I mean? That includes you. So I think it's easy to it's easy to kind of, do that, and say certain things, but we just don't have enough information, y'all. We don't have enough information to really talk about a thing. You know what I mean? There's so many different, small, little open markets that are opening and making way. And it's all happening so fast. You know what I mean? The context is changing every 6 months. So it's going to be something that we're going to really need like a few years, 20 years, you know what I mean, before we can really come back and say what was going on during these times. And I think what I like to do, at least what I try to do on my platform, is document these things that I do see, document some of the cultural trends that I do see, not just from like a social commentary point of view, but just from a way in which it changes how we interact with one another, how we see the world, you know what I mean? What we're believing about each other as African American people or whatever, right? Like I try to document that and just kind of save it and like archive it and then potentially, come back and if 20, 30 years from now, do a whole thing of like, these were the trends that was taking place. You know what I mean? But like I said, when those trends are changing so rapidly, when the context is changing so rapidly, it's hard to do that. You know what I mean? It's hard to be in any position where, you're seeking a definitive because it's always changing. The variables are always changing, right? 4 months ago, if a guy was, talking with a girl at the store or whatever, and there was 3 guys and 1 girl, it was like, this is bad, right? Fast forward today, and there's 1 girl, she's with a group of guys, and it's like, oh, these are my male friends, right? And I'm saying that to say, because I'm seeing, certain content that kind of showcases that. And for minor reasons, we would say that as bad, you know what I mean? Just less than a year ago, right? So I'm just giving examples of our ways of relating and how things change. Right. I think here shortly, we're going to actually kind of start to see an uptick in romantic coupling because trends are changing, right? There was a trend where it was like, hey, screw the opposite race, do this, do that, focus on your money, whatever. Now people are saying, hey, people are lonely, people need to be coupled, people want da 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 da. You know what I mean? So it's just like when the narrative is always changing and we're all a part of this, this social engineering, this social project with Meta and so forth. It's just hard to document. That's all I'm saying. So it's hard to reach a definitive because we're still living in it in real time. So at the very least, the only thing we can really have is observations. At the very least, the only thing we can have is opinions. So let's not be too quick to say that, we are the journalists, we are the ones who can see above the mist of it all, because we can't. We're actually in it. And sometimes it's our own mist and our own bias motivated by our own desires to generate an audience, to have profit, right, for our content. And so it's like we also have to be mindful of the ways in which we partake in that honestly. And so I think for any creator out there, my big ups would be to just be mindful that anytime you're creating and you're profitable, you're making money, be humble because you're a part of the problem, right? And I'm saying that to be direct, you know what I mean? But I'm saying that like for real, you know what I mean? So it's like, hey, if you get money, you're doing your thing, great, love that for you. You know what I mean? But sometimes when it comes to the capital, the waters get a little murky. So you just also have to be honest with yourself as well. Peace.